To have you back. Well, 27 years into democracy and South Africa is still grappling with poverty and inequality. The country's wealth is in the hands of the few, while the majority is dependent on handouts. So let's discuss this even further. We're joined by political economist, that's Mr. Mandla Lionel Isaacs from, of course, Zehuti Advisories. Thank you so much, Mr. Isaacs, for your time, and good morning to you. Happy Freedom Day to you as we commemorate, 27 years into our democracy. But unfortunately, we have to start here because it is the reality of the country. I mean, I went through a couple of, world and global indexes, amongst them being the Economic Freedom of the World Index, and it tells quite a sad story and a sad tale of South Africa's economy. Not only the country, Russia and Tanzania also lagging behind, and it begs to question, why doesn't the economy and the state of democracy sort of reflect, or rather, why doesn't the economy reflect the state of democracy that we so much hear about from government throughout the years?
Good morning, Tumelo, and happy Freedom Day. Well, I mean, the question you ask is the fundamental question of our time, I suppose. Frankly, all of us in society acknowledge this. The ruling party acknowledges this in their, policy reflections every 5 years. And I think all of us recognize this in society, that as much as we've made tremendous progress since the advent of democracy, the country's obviously opened up and become freer. We've seen the growth of the black middle class. Our economy has grown in absolute terms. But as you say, we still have fundamental challenges in terms of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. To use the government's own statistics in 2018, only about 20% of our population is considered middle class, with about 4% considered to be affluent or elite, with half of the population living in poverty and another quarter threatened by poverty, so sort of working class and occasionally finding themselves threatened by poverty. One of the most unequal societies in the world, and crucially, only just over about half of South African adults work, or working age adults work, whereas in our developing country peers, that number is closer to 80%. So what we've seen is that as much as we've made some progress, we have fallen behind other developing countries. We have not picked up onto long-term, sustained, inclusive growth. And that's because we have been unable to transform the structure of our economy.
I mean, I've been reading a couple of, articles about, different types of economies, the free economies, and how so many, for example, millionaires are seen in free economies. Even Elon Musk was mentioned as that South African who made it quite big in the United States. Where do you think, in detail, are the challenges, and where do you think are the missed opportunities from government's perspective?
Well, I would say, particularly since the last financial crisis, we fell behind after the commodity boom of the early 2000s. And interestingly, there's prospects of a commodity boom starting now, which somewhat softened the blow of the COVID-19 pandemic, with the economy not contracting as much as government thought it would. But to be honest, the reason that we lag behind our developing country peers is fairly clear. Number one, we have failed to generate a competitive export economy. I cannot stress this enough. As much as economists find it very difficult to give a very specific recipe and say, do these things and you will achieve economic growth, that can be sort of contested. What is clear, however, is that the handful of late developing countries that developed very rapidly in the 20th century, so did so in a generation without stumbling into a sea of oil, like a handful of lucky countries were able to. The countries that were able to achieve that did so through exporting. They focused rigorously on exports. We're talking about the Asian tigers, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong. And so those countries focused rigorously on exports. So that's number one. We have not created a competitive exporting economy. We've seen that, in fact, with our manufacturing levels declining over the last 30 years. We've basically deindustrialized consistently over the last 30 years, which is the opposite of what you would want to do. Obviously, over the last decade, our power constraints have been a problem. It's very difficult to convince people to invest billions of rands in new capacity, which is what generally underpins economic growth, if you cannot guarantee electricity. Then you could also add our logistics constraints. We did miss out on the full extent of the commodity boom last time. in the early 2000s because we simply couldn't rail enough minerals to our ports, and our ports didn't have enough capacity to efficiently export all the minerals that there was demand for. And finally, you could say that our policy and regulatory environment has not been as conducive as you would like.
Right.
Because obviously, we've taken an inordinately long time to conclude on key policy areas.
I mean,
I think finally, I would just add
if I could just jump in there, Mandla, due to time. I mean, this is obviously all the points that a government can consider, South Africans also take note of. But because we understand the President will be addressing the country in today's commemorations, his theme will be the meaning of freedom under COVID-19. You mentioned COVID-19 and that blow that we got from the pandemic, obviously. I want to rephrase this theme and ask you this question. What does, economic freedom mean under COVID-19? For South Africa?
Well, that's an interesting one. I mean, if you think about over the course of the pandemic, we've had quite a few tensions between government and society about how the economy can function in the course of this pandemic. And, one understands that it was unprecedented territory for the government, but we obviously had some questionable regulations throughout. I do think that it is useful for us to reflect on this idea of freedom, and that in our democracy, we really do, it's not just important that we have political freedom, it's important that we have economic freedom. Now, normally, economic freedom is thought of in terms of our, whether or not we have access to wealth. For example, the economic freedom fighters talk about, the racial and class dimensions of our economy. What I would probably also stress is that economic freedom also means a regulatory environment that allows as many individuals as possible to take part in the economy and do so with as little hindrance, as little red tape, as little state blockage as possible. And I think that's something that we can do better on. I think we need smart regulation, smart policy, but not red tape and bureaucracy that holds us back. Too often, I think our economy is designed around these big, huge companies that can afford compliance and collective bargaining agreements, whereas many of the most successful companies in the world are those that make it very easy for new businesses to start and grow and for small businesses to thrive. Because actually, in most countries, it is small businesses which employ the majority of people in the country.
All right, we'll leave it then. Thank you so much for your contribution to this conversation. Mandla Lionel Isaacs talking to us there about economic freedom in South Africa.